Hi, this is Dr. Fryer, and today is February the 28th, I guess, 2023, and this is my narrated sketchnote for the video Moon Hoax Not by S.G. Collins. We've been talking about Froot Loop Conspiracy Theories in our media literacy class for middle school, and we've been talking about videos that discuss the moon landing, and some people say the moon landing was faked, and Collins argues that it was not. He explains that in the late 1960s, rocket technology was getting a lot better. He references some real conspiracies that happened at the time when Wernher von Braun and other Nazi scientists were brought to the United States to work for NASA. And there was a Cold War, of course, and competition with the Soviet Union. But he says overall, we didn't have the technology to fake the moon landing, that the younger you are, it seems like the more you believe in movie magic. And so, this idea that Stanley Kubrick could fake it, it just couldn't happen. And he goes into some detail. He explains that the idea of exposure, like the reason why you couldn't see stars in the sky is because they were exposing for the surface of the moon, not for the night sky, and the exposure wouldn't have been able to capture both. Technically, he doesn't say this, but it's because HDR or high dynamic range images were not possible at that time. And so you couldn't expose both the night sky and the surface of the moon at the same time. He talks about shadows and how shadows and sunlight really work, and why that wasn't faked, and how the flag was just moving in the vacuum of space. I think there was actually a pole at the top of it, but it wasn't blowing in the breeze. And so he talks about some of those things that J.P. Sears had addressed. He also goes into a lot of detail about how slow motion works and how they only had the technology to take 30 seconds of slow motion video in 1969. And he talks about if it was faked, like with Stanley Kubrick, all the things they would have done for this long live stream, which was broadcast, to the world, and millions of people watched at the same time. So lastly, he ends by talking about what matters and why it's important to, have facts. And if people think everything is a lie, that really is dangerous. So in terms of checking him out as a source, I guess, we researched, and he's more of an expert than J.P. Sears because he's a filmmaker, and so he has a lot of knowledge about film and how film is made. He also, brought in a lot of specific responses to some of the things that Sears had talked about, like I said, with shadows on the moon and exposure and science and technology. So he mentions the inverse square law, but also just how shadows work and things that he's learned shooting film. And he challenges us to go out and look at these kinds of things and try to understand, film. And that's where he gets into so many details about what it would have taken to shoot on 35 millimeter and to fake it. So he does seem to be a much better source when it comes to this idea of whether or not the moon landing was faked, because if it was, then the idea of astronauts, or the video film of astronauts jumping around on the moon, would have had to been, created in a film studio. They just didn't have that technology. It could have been faked today, but it couldn't have been faked in 1969. So lastly, when we are comparing the two videos, J.P. Sears really seems to be wanting to make people laugh, to say kind of outlandish things. There's a lot of jokes. At the end of his video, Collins says, "Oh, my check from NASA arrived," which is, a sarcastic joke, like he was getting paid for this. But he doesn't try to appeal to humor and try to make people laugh. It really is a more serious video that he is making. And so in conclusion, I think this is a good example of how we can seek trusted coverage using the SIFT framework when we encounter a source or some information that we are unfamiliar with, or especially that, makes us respond in some kind of an emotional way. So that's the stop of SIFT. We've investigated the sources. We investigated Sears. We investigated Collins. And we found, Collins to be a more trusted source. And so we've done 3 of the 4 steps of the SIFT framework, and hopefully this has provided a good example of how students and people of all ages can really investigate, especially with lateral reading, going to other sources to find out about a source, the way in which we can use that to try to identify the sources that we can trust and make our own judgments and opinions about what is true and what is not.